I have had a very long commitment to the labor movement since my election to the State House of Representatives in 1980. So I have been doing this and have had the privilege of serving the people of the state of Hawaii and to a wider group since 1980. So that's almost 30 years in public service, and I feel very privileged to now serve in the United States Senate, where I continue to fight for working families. Thank you. I fight with you for unions and working families. And I co-chair with Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee's Labor Council. And our goal in this council is to keep and strengthen our ties with our friends in the labor union. So we have regular times when we have breakfast or gatherings, and we keep in touch so that we can listen to what the ongoing concerns are and we can share what's going on in the Senate. Of course, the labor movement built and protected the middle class in Hawaii as well as nationally. And the history of the labor movement in Hawaii is one of strife, of challenges, and they played a major role, APA union members, who stood together to organize for better wages and eventually organize for statehood in Hawaii. Nationally, the labor movement is strengthened when all voices are included, all APA voices, Hispanics, African Americans, South Asians, East Asians, Pacific Islanders. We are strongest when all working people are in this together. In Congress, we've seen continuing attacks on unions and working people over the last few years. In fact, I served for 6 years on the House Education and Labor Committee, which after 2010 and the Republicans gained the majority, they eliminated the word labor from that committee and changed it to education and workforce. I continue to serve on that committee, and we saw amendments to gut Davis-Bacon, which I know you're all familiar with the importance of this law, without which we will see a race to the bottom in contracting. We saw amendments to eliminate the basic right to organize by encouraging, for example, to the right to work for less laws with non-union labor, and continuing attacks on the National Labor Relations Board. In the House, I spoke against these amendments time and again, and I can never forget the time when we were having a marathon battle between the Democrats and the Republicans on the House floor. This went on for days and hours, and I can't forget at 3 a.m. My leadership asked me to be on the floor to speak against yet another effort to gut Davis-Bacon. So these anti-labor, anti-union attacks continue in the Senate. And just a few weeks ago, we saw amendments like these on what should be a bipartisan transportation appropriations bill. Now, the attacks on NLRB were particularly strident, and they played a major part in a big change to Senate procedures, which I supported. As you know, the NLRB is the critical referee between labor and management. The board certifies union elections when workers try to organize, and the board can rule against unfair practices, like when management intimidates workers against voting for a union. And we all know what happened in the Boeing case. Republicans tried to defund the NLRB and let employers offer frivolous appeals and delay its decisions. In the Senate, Republicans have tried to block President Obama's nominees for all types of posts, including the NLRB, so that we don't have a functioning board. As mentioned, we achieved in the Senate a big bipartisan victory a few weeks ago. After months, you know what's coming. After months of Republican obstruction of Obama's nominees, senators got together in the historic old Senate chamber to come to an agreement. We discussed and debated for over 3 hours. There was no press, no cameras. The senators spoke candidly and frankly, freely. Finally, we agreed to hold a vote So no filibuster on a limited group of nominees. I supported such a move because of my belief that the president should be able to choose his or her team to get things done. Finally, after more than 10 years of not having a fully constituted NLRB, we confirmed or reconfirmed the set of 5 members to this board. And now the board can get back to work and help settle disputes between management and labor. And one of the president's NLRB picks is Kent Hirozawa, the first ever Asian American to serve on that board. I really felt good when I voted to confirm that nomination on the floor of the Senate. We also have a lifelong champion of justice for working people in our new Secretary of Labor, Tom Perez. That was a hard-fought nomination battle, too. This was also the summer of immigration reform. APALA has been a key player in helping to bring about comprehensive immigration reform, and your convention schedule reflects an ongoing commitment to fix our broken immigration system. Now, immigration is something personal to me, and as Darren mentioned, when I was young, I grew up in Japan on my grandparents' rice farm, where my mother sent me to live with my grandparents at the age of 3 because of family circumstances. My mother endured a terrible marriage at the hands of my father, who was an alcoholic and a compulsive gambler. We had little stability or money in our family as a result of his addictions. But instead of watching our family continue to suffer, my mother made the very courageous decision to plot and plan in secret to get her and her children, there were 3 of us, far, far away from my father and his family. Because in those days, of course, the woman and the children were considered the property of the male. That was my father. So just before I was 8, my mother managed to, in secret, get us on board the President Cleveland, and we set sail for a land called America, a place called Hawaii that I knew nothing about. And we came to this country in steerage. And like so many immigrants, those early years were tough. We didn't have much money. I know what it's like to run out of money by the end of the month to pay for necessities, to pay for food, for rent. And we all began school not knowing any English. And in the beginning, my mother worked at a Japanese language paper for minimum wage with no job security, no benefits. So I know the battles that our families face all across our country. We didn't have much, but we persevered. My experiences as an immigrant help inform my work on immigration reform, and I had the privilege of chairing a full Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on the impact of immigration on women and children. I think some of you might have been there or watched the proceedings. The committee received testimony about the importance of allowing immigrant families to be together in this country, because we all know that the success of immigrants in this country is the story of the success of immigrants and their families. So it's so important that family unity remain a guiding principle of immigration. We also heard about the importance of making sure that immigrants receive health care, have access to health care. And we heard about the need to include labor protections so that immigrant workers don't have to suffer abuses in order to achieve the American dream. And during the bill's markup, my colleagues and I worked together in a bipartisan way for 3 weeks in committee and for several weeks after in debates on the floor. And throughout this process, labor fought alongside us to support principles in the immigration bill that reflect the values of the labor movement and family unification. the AFL-CIO or its coalition supported many of my amendments that were added to the bill, including providing Dreamers access to federal student loans and work-study programs. And I know we have a lot of Dreamers in the audience who are in school right now. And so important for many of us from our delegation, we were able to include language that would allow Filipino World War II veterans to finally reunite with their children. They have been waiting decades for this. Our delegation the Hawaii delegation has introduced this World War II Veterans Reunification Bill, and I introduced it every year since being elected to the U.S. House and now in the Senate. And with your help, this provision is finally in the Senate bill. Thank you. I want to thank APALA also for your help during the immigration reform debate on the floor. APALA urged the AFL-CIO and others to support my fight to make the reform bill in the Senate fairer to women. I led a bipartisan group of women senators to fight for an amendment that would establish a category in the newly created merit-based point system for new immigrants that would give women a fairer opportunity to immigrate to our country. And the reason this amendment was so important is that the reform bill as written inadvertently hurts potential female immigrants by giving more points for the kinds of education and high-skill work experience that women in these countries often do not have access to. And I argued that we should not cement into the U.S. immigration law the inequitable treatment of women across the globe. There were some 400 amendments to the Senate immigration bill that were filed for this bill. And because of the support we were able to build with the help of APALA and others during the floor debate, my women's amendment became the top priority for Democrats while we negotiated which Democratic and Republican amendments could be called forth and could be voted upon. Because the way the Senate operated and on this bill was that we had to go by unanimous consent, which meant that every single amendment had to be agreed to by Democrats and Republicans. This is why, although 400 amendments were filed for this bill, we had to agree on which ones would be voted upon. And in these negotiations, thanks to the help of so many of you, and as well as there were some 100 organizations, labor unions, the Catholic Church, organizations all across the board who supported this women's amendment. This amendment became our top priority for negotiations. Sadly, these negotiations broke down. So none of these amendments came to the floor. But the important thing is that we managed to pass in a bipartisan way in the Senate an immigration bill that will help millions and millions of people in our country. And while it's not a perfect bill, it's certainly a step that will help so many people in our country. So now it's the House's turn, and your voice continues to be critical. Not only did the APA community vote for President Obama by nearly an 80% margin, immigration is a critical and often personal APA issue. Approximately 60% of the APAs in this country are foreign-born, and many of our loved ones are still overseas waiting to be able to come to our country. There are more than 4 million people in the family immigration backlog, and over 40% of that backlog is from Asian countries, including Korea, India, and the Philippines. I think many of you probably have family members who are among the 4 million waiting to come to our country. And over 10% of the undocumented population in our country are Asians, adding up to nearly 1 million people. So immigration is an APA issue. 1 in 10 dreamers are APAs. So immigration is an APA issue, and House members need a reminder from all of you in their home districts, in your home districts this August. It's time to remind your House members that they have a job to do when they return to Washington, D.C. in September. They need to pass a common sense, humane immigration bill with a path to citizenship that treats immigrant workers with decency and fairness. We need immigration reform that reflects our values as Americans. Early to bed, early to rise. Work like hell and organize. I've heard this call at many a union gathering, and I call it out this morning. Early to bed, early to rise. Work like hell and organize, because when we work together, we can get things done. Mahalo nui loa for this honor. Thank you very, very much. Aloha. Thank you. Thank you.